Biting wind clawed at his face as Liam staggered along the hard shoulder of the motorway, his breath curling in faint clouds under the stark glow of the sodium streetlights. His jacket, hanging open and useless, offered no protection against the December chill that seemed to seep into his bones. His phone was dead. Of course it was. And the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet was the faint hum of cars in the distance, their headlights like fleeting ghosts in the dark. He hadn't meant to throw up in the cab. It had come on suddenly, the taste of cheap lager and greasy chips rushing back up in a violent surge. The driver's fury had been immediate and volcanic, a string of colorful Scouse profanities accompanying the squeal of tires as the cab lurched to a stop. Kicked out with nothing more than a slammed door and a trail of rubber on the asphalt, Liam now found himself stranded somewhere outside of Liverpool, his sense of direction muddled by the fog in his head. He tried to get his bearings, squinting at the shadowy outline of trees and road signs, but they only seemed to mock him. The motorway, endless and unfamiliar, stretched ahead, offering little in the way of hope. Each step felt like a gamble, one that might lead him closer to home or further into nowhere, or worse, witness. He swore under his breath, his voice hoarse. "Bloody typical," he muttered, his voice dissipating into the icy night. Somewhere out there, his mates were probably still laughing in a warm pub, swapping stories and downing another round. Liam grimaced at the thought, his stomach turning again, though this time from regret rather than lager. Liam fumbled with his phone, the cracked screen a spiderweb of poor life decisions. Before it died, he managed to reopen Uber after a few failed attempts, his frozen fingers struggling to hit the right spots. A faint glimmer of hope stirred in his chest when the app loaded, but as he glanced at his messages, half a dozen missed calls from his mates, a blurry photo of someone's kebab, and a "Where'd you go, lad?" the screen flickered ominously. No, he groaned, thumbing at the power button like it might magically revive the battery. When the screen faded to black for good, he let out a roar of frustration. His voice echoed into the empty night.
"Brilliant, just bloody brilliant."
He flung the useless phone into his pocket, resisting the urge to throw it into the ditch. A little while passed since then, but as he was reliving those memories, he heard something. A sound faint and alien, barely audible over the low rumble of passing traffic. A slow, rhythmic noise, like something scraping or rustling in the fields beyond the motorway barrier. He froze mid-step, his breath hitching in his chest. At first he thought it might be the wind, teasing at dried stalks or the distant movements of a fox, but the sound persisted, growing louder as if drawn closer by his stillness. Liam squinted into the darkness, trying to make out the source. The fields beyond the motorway were a patchwork of shadows, the bare trees stark against the faint glow of the city far behind him. He took a cautious step closer to the barrier, peering into the black expanse.
"Hello?"
His voice cracked slightly, the bravado faltering as the sound ceased abruptly, leaving only the hum of distant engines and the thump of his own heart. He stood there for a moment, his pulse quickening as an unease began to creep in, clawing at the edges of his beer-addled mind. The scene stretched out in cold, oppressive silence. The motorway lay desolate, its twin lanes glistening faintly under the grating glow of amber streetlights. Their harsh light didn't illuminate so much as it carved the world into sharp contrasts, patches of glaring brightness against the all-consuming black of the surrounding countryside. The asphalt shimmered faintly, a mirror for the frost clinging to the edges of the road. No cars passed now. No headlights cut the dark. It was as though the world had forgotten this stretch of road entirely. Beyond the metal crash barrier, the countryside spread like a yawning void. What little detail Liam could make out, a skeletal tree here, a hedge rising against the horizon there, only served to deepen the oppressive sense of isolation. The blackness swallowed everything just beyond reach, an infinite canvas of unknown shapes and imagined threats. Liam's eyes darted back to the fields. His breath curled in front of him as he strained to make out anything beyond the faint outlines etched in moonlight. The fields were wide and barren, save for the occasional dark blot of a distant bush or tree. They seemed to stretch endlessly, merging with the sky in an indistinctive haze. His ears strained too, searching for the sound he'd heard moments ago, that rustling noise that had sent his heart racing. For a moment, nothing came but the wind, tugging at his hair and whistling softly through the sparse trees. He began to think it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks, the booze warping the silence into imagined menace. He let out a breath, relaxing his shoulders, but then it came again, louder this time.
You right, kid?
The words cut through the night, the voice oddly casual, as though it belonged to someone bumping into a mate at a pub. Liam stiffened at the surprise, his heart skipping a beat before he exhaled sharply and rolled his eyes. Of course, it's just some bloke. Maybe a farmer finishing a late-night shift, or some poor sod like him, stranded on the wrong side of the motorway. He sighed and let out a small, breathy laugh.
Yeah, I'm fine, mate,
he called back into the dark, his voice echoing faintly.
Just having a night from hell, like.
The voice didn't answer, and the silence that followed felt unnaturally heavy. Liam shifted on his feet, the cold seeping through the thin soles of his trainers. He waited for some kind of reply, eyes still locked on the black void of the fields, but the silence stretched unnervingly, thick and impenetrable, making the night feel heavier with each passing second. The faint wind stirred the brittle grass along the barrier, but nothing else moved. No rustling, no footprints, nothing to suggest someone was there at all. He cleared his throat, swallowing the knot of unease forming in his chest.
Mate, you alright?
He called again, his voice carrying less confidence this time.
Look, if you're having a laugh, it's not funny, eh?
The words hung in the air unanswered. The darkness seemed to press closer, the vast emptiness of the fields now feeling far too wide, too exposed. Liam stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets, his fingers brushing the dead weight of his phone. He opened his mouth to shout again, if only to break the tension, but the voice cut him off.
Can you give us a hand there, lad?
Liam froze. The words were clearer now, closer. The tone was calm, even friendly, but there was something about it that prickled at the edges of his awareness. It wasn't quite right. He couldn't pinpoint what it was. Maybe the odd cadence, or the way it seemed to echo faintly, as though the speaker was both nearby and far away at the same time. He took a cautious step toward the barrier, peering over it into the void. His breath quickened, fogging in front of him.
Where are you?
He asked, his voice shaking slightly despite his effort to sound steady. The field offered no answer, only the faint rustle of the wind and the distant hum of the motorway. But the voice had sounded so close this time, as though the speaker could be standing just a few feet away, hidden by the thick shroud of darkness.
Mate?
He tried again, his unease now clawing at him, a growing weight in his chest. His hand gripped the cold metal of the crash barrier, knuckles white. The bark startled Liam, sharp and sudden, coming from the exact same spot in the field where the voice had originated. It was gruff, the kind of bark that belonged to a substantial-sized dog. He froze again, his pulse spiking as he squinted into the blackness, trying to catch any sign of movement. Nothing emerged, but the uneasy sensation of being watched crept over him.
"Sorry, mate,"
Liam called out, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow even to himself.
"I'd help, but I'm in a bit of a rush. You know how it is."
His words were rushed, his breath visible in uneven puffs.
"Good luck, though. Hope you get it sorted."
The voice didn't answer, but the silence felt heavier now, pressing down like a weight on his shoulders. Just as he turned to walk away, there it was, a sound like something moving, fast and deliberate through the tall grass of the field. The rustling was sharp and purposeful, accompanied by a crunching noise that made the hair on the back of Liam's neck stand on end. His first thought was a madman, someone unhinged, maybe drunk like him, letting their dog loose to chase him down. His heart jumped at the image, and panic bloomed in his chest. Without thinking, he broke into a trot, his boots scuffing against the gravel of the hard shoulder. Reaching the other side of the motorway, Liam swung his leg over the metal crash barrier, his movements clumsy in his haste. He dropped down onto the frosty grass and stumbled slightly, his breath coming fast and shallow. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. For the next 15 minutes, Liam kept walking. His pace was brisk, his ears straining for the faintest hint of pursuit. But the night was still now, the countryside eerily quiet save for the soft whistle of the wind and the occasional hum of distant traffic. Each step took him farther from the fields and closer, he hoped, to the warm glow of civilization. By the time his breath settled, Liam allowed himself to slow. The motorway stretched ahead in an endless line of monotony, the orange glow of the streetlights blurring into one another like a surreal, dreamlike tunnel. No sound came from behind him, no barking, no voice. The only thing following him now was the nagging sense that he wasn't truly alone. The road curved gently ahead, leading to an exit marked by a faded green sign that promised destinations Liam didn't recognize. His focus drifted for a moment, eyes scanning the stretch of darkness around him. That was when he noticed it. A figure standing perfectly still beneath one of the amber streetlights farther up the exit road. Liam slowed, his pulse quickening. The figure was too far away to make out clearly, but it was unmistakably human, their silhouette sharp against the warm glow of the streetlight. They stood motionless, head slightly tilted as if watching something, or someone. The sight sent a ripple of unease through Liam, but he shook it off. This was the motorway, after all. Plenty of people had weird nights like his. He forced a grin and raised his voice, the attempt at casual friendliness coming out shakier than he'd intended.
"All right there, mate. You got kicked out of a taxi too?"
The figure didn't move. For a moment, he thought that the figure might not have heard him. He stepped closer, the crunch of his footsteps loud in the oppressive quiet.
"Bad luck, innit? Bloody drivers these days,"
he added, trailing off as his words felt heavier, more pointless. Then the figure moved. Not much, just enough for Liam to see their head turn toward him. His stomach twisted when the person spoke, the words impossibly familiar, their voice steady and calm.
"Can you give us a hand there, lad?"
The exact same phrase, the same tone, the same cadence as before. Liam stopped dead in his tracks, the color draining from his face. His breath hitched, and his stomach dropped as though he'd stepped off of a cliff. His mind raced to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he'd misheard. Maybe. But deep down he knew there was no mistaking it. It wasn't just the words, it was the voice. The same voice in the field, now coming from the figure standing under the streetlight, unnervingly still, their face obscured by shadow. Liam's throat was dry, his thoughts tangling into knots as he stared at the figure, frozen in place. Liam's heart thundered in his chest as he stood frozen, staring at the figure beneath the streetlight. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. His breath came in shallow gasps, the cold night air cutting at his lungs. He tried to force himself to look away, to think clearly, but his gaze remained fixed on the silhouette. That's when he saw it. The figure began to shift, subtly at first, a slight tilt of the head, a movement that seemed unnervingly fluid. Then the limbs began to stretch, elongating unnaturally. The shadowed arms grew longer and thinner, fingers twisting into grotesque, jointless extensions. The legs followed, bending at impossible angles, as though whatever stood beneath the streetlight was unraveling itself into something entirely inhuman. From the figure came a sound. A perfectly repeated bark, harsh and guttural, identical to the one Liam heard from the field. His stomach churned, bile rising in his throat as the barking suddenly ceased, replaced by something else. Something worse.
I don't like that man,
The voice said, high-pitched and trembling.
He's scary.
Liam's breath hitched, and he took a stumbling step backwards. The words echoed in his ears, the innocent tone clashing horribly with the distorted figure before him. And then the scream came. It was piercing and shrill, a child's scream full of terror and pain. The sound cut through the night like a blade, jolting Liam into action. He turned and bolted, his legs moving before his mind could fully catch up. Adrenaline surged as he sprinted down the road, his footfalls pounding against the asphalt, the echoes of the scream chasing him into the dark. The road was a blur of light and shadow, the grating glow of the streetlights flashing above him like a warning. His breath came in ragged bursts, each exhale carrying a sob of fear. His focus was entirely on escape, on putting as much distance as he could between himself and the nightmare he'd left behind. He didn't hear the car until it was too late. The blinding headlights appeared suddenly, hurtling toward him. Liam's scream joined the shriek of the car's brakes as he collided with the metal and glass, the impact sending him spinning into darkness. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the first thing Liam registered as he blinked awake. His body felt heavy, wrapped in a cocoon of numbness and dull aches. Bright, sterile light flooded his vision, and the faint antiseptic smell confirmed where he was, a hospital. He groaned softly, his throat dry and scratchy, and shifted slightly, the movement immediately sending sharp protest through his ribs. His breath hitched, and he froze, letting the pain settle before daring to move again. Slowly his eyes adjusted to the room. Pale walls, a curtained-off window, and the quiet hum of machines filled his senses. As his gaze swept the room, it landed on the figure slumped in the chair beside his bed. A man, head bowed, his long hair spilling forward to cover his face. His posture was hunched, arms folded across his chest as though he'd fallen asleep mid-guard. Liam felt a surge of relief so profound it brought tears to his eyes. His brother. Of course his brother had come. He couldn't have imagined who else would have bothered to sit by his side. A small, hoarse laugh escaped him, though it quickly turned into a grimace, as the motion jarred his battered body. "You daft git," he muttered, his voice barely more than a croak. "You're gonna ruin your back sleeping like that." The figure didn't stir, but Liam didn't mind. Just seeing him there was enough to dispel some of the lingering dread clawing at the edges of his thoughts. He let his head sink back into the pillow, closing his eyes briefly and exhaling a shaky breath. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of safety.
"You right there, mate? You get kicked out of a taxi too?"
The voice was unmistakable. His own, distorted slightly as though played back on an old warped tape. The words hung in the air, far too loud in the suffocating stillness of the room. The figure in the guest chair, the one he thought was his brother, began to move. Slowly. Too slowly. The hair that obscured his face shifted, sliding back in an unnatural way, as though it were being drawn upwards by invisible hands. Liam's heart pounded as he watched, his stomach knotting tighter with every agonizing second. The face came into view, and his relief turned to ice. "Can you give us a hand there?"